Welcome. In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about REST APIs. A REST API is set up in such a way that when you make the request, it responds with the data, usually in either JSON or XML format. Now, primarily the REST APIs that we're going to work with are going to be either public or private. For the private ones, you'll need an API key, and there's a little more to it than what we're going to be looking at today. But for the ones that are just completely public, we have a very specific format that we tend to look at these in. Now, the whole purpose of this is so that when you send a signal from your computer saying, hey, I want you to give me some data to the cloud sees the signal, packages up the data that you need the way you want, and sends it back. That interaction is what we typically would refer to as the fetch action or the get. So it's reaching out for just all the data that you're requesting and just give it back. That's all we want to do at that part. So that is a GET request. It's also the R if you ever see CRUD operations. CRUD stands for create, read, update, and delete. And the R is what we start off with typically because it's just grabbing data and coming back, and it's really easy to see if it works. So looking at this project, I have a very basic setup here for just kind of a general app that all it's going to do is run my GET and return it and show me the data. So we have to have a specific URL that this is going to reach out to. Now, in my case, I'm going to use an application called JSON Server. What it does is it allows me to have some JSON data set up in this format right here, and I can set up the data any way that I like, and this is going to be what we call our endpoint. You may also see it referred to as a resource. So this is what's going to go at the end of that web address. Now with JSON Server, you're going to save it as some type of JSON file, and you'll save it in just kind of the root directory that you're using for your project. Now, when it comes time to launch it and actually have it do those interactions as an API, we'll go in here and we'll tell it JSON server watch db.json. And what that's going to do is it's going to have it start watching that file, serving it out as an API. Now, in this case, it created it on port 3000. So our endpoint is going to be http://localhost:3000/users. Now, anytime I make an interaction with that endpoint, then in my db.json file up here, it's going to change the data, just like a real API would change the data in the database. So we are going to use this to mock our backend connection or our database. So I'm going to click and look here. We've got localhost 3000. I'm going to copy that whole address right there. And then back on my main.js where I define my URL here, I'm going to paste that in. Now, if you are anticipating that you might have a bunch of stuff running on your system, it's oftentimes really good to make a variable here for your port, and then to do this URL with template literal, and then you can just put in your variable for port here, and then all you have to do is change this part, and you don't have to go in the middle and risk typos or any kind of problems like that. So it's really easy to set up. Now, if you're going to work with multiple endpoints, you might define those as other variables. And then you can also add that into this part. And so that way you just kind of feed in what you're wanting. For this, we're just going to leave it where it's at right now. Now, I have divided out in my application here, my delete, my get, my post, and my put. The first one we're going to look at is my get. Now, the whole purpose of this get is to reach out, grab some data, and give it back to us. So we set this up as an async function. And the reason that we want it to be asynchronous is because we want to be able to tell it to wait on the response to come back, and then to wait on that response to be converted. So we start off up here. The try catch block is there to prevent errors from crashing our application. So it will try what we're doing in these brackets, and then if there is an error, it's going to console that out for us, but it does not kill the application. We're still good to work. Now, I've set this up to take in our URL. So for our first part, we declare this variable response, and then we say we're going to set you equal to the result of this fetch. Now, we want it to wait till that fetch response gets back to move on. So we put this await keyword in so that the asynchronous function knows to stop right there, wait till that data comes back, and then attach it to that response variable. Now we're going to do the same thing again on this next line where we declare our data variable, and we're going to convert that response into JSON format. Now the reason for converting it is it comes over in a string format. That's the way these responses will kick back to us. And so we want to convert it to JSON so that we're not dealing with the entire string or with the promise. Instead, we're getting that exact JSON data, and we can use it just like any other array or object in JavaScript. Now, these two lines are the most important. They're the ones that actually do our part where it's reaching out and doing our request and response that you typically will see. So we want our computer to ask another one for the data, and then when it comes back, before we use it over here, we're going to convert it to that JSON, and then we're allowed to do whatever we want with it. Now, in a lot of cases here, you'll see developers put just like a little console log, and when it returns and it converts, it'll spit that data out right there. It's not a bad idea in development, but you want to make sure you remove it before you put this into production. So after that, our function will just strictly return the data that has properly been converted at that point. And that right there is all there is to a basic get. So ideally, if this is set up properly, when we start our developer server down here for the front end, we'll do npm run dev, and this is a Vite vanilla application. So we do npm run dev, and then we're going to click on localhost here, and it opens up. And all I have showing on the page is that JavaScript logo, but if I go to my inspect panel, I should see some data commented out or commented in the console. Now, the reason it's doing that, because we talked about right here, a lot of times you'll see them console it out. Actually, over here, where I'm calling get data, I'm having it when it comes back console that data out. So I have this set up in such a way that it is also going to act like an async function, and when it returns, then it will console my data. So if I go back over to my browser and I look at this data, it's basic JSON objects. And we can use that dot notation to access the different items in here. And with the way that JSON server is set up, it'll reach out and update what's in the file. And so if we do that GET request again with stuff added to it, it's going to show us the extra stuff or take it away just like a real API would do. So let's look at a couple of these other calls that we might do. So the next most common is going to be a post. Now with a post, you're going to take in two props. You're going to take in your URL to your endpoint that you're using, and you're going to take in some form of data that you're going to add to your database. Now, normally I will go on and create the object that I'm wanting to add. And what I mean by that is over here, this is a specific object type that needs to be taken in. So each object I send this way needs to have an ID, a name, and an email that's going to go with it. It also needs to be formatted in the proper ways. And if you're using a TypeScript application, then that'll kind of help with making sure that you keep the right data types for the right places here. So if we go back over to our post, we take in those two things so that we can use them at different places in here. Now I have a lot of extra instructions in the comments here. This is stuff that will be posted on helpcodeit.com in the CRUD operations with APIs page. But looking at this response, it's a little bit different because right here we put this comma signifying that we're going to send some other information with our call. Now, the information we're sending is going to be the headers and the body of our message that's going back and forth between the API. So we tell it what method we want to use. So that is, do we want to use a get, a post, put, or delete? In this case, we're wanting to add data, so that's a post. We also give it this header that defines our content type as application JSON. We're just letting the API know, hey, the stuff that we're sending in is set up as needs to be set up as a JSON object. Now, this next part with the body, this is the meat of our message. It's our actual object that we want to add to our db.json. So we need to use this json.stringify to turn it into a string the way that the API likes to receive it. So we'll put our data, which is our object, in here so that this converts it as it's sending it. Now, when the data came in on our get, you'll notice we converted it to JSON there. That's because when it sends us that data back, it's going to send us that data back as a string or as a promise, and we have to break it apart and convert it to the way that we're going to need to use it. So now that this is kind of converted for us, we can move on past this. So this request will go, and for most REST APIs, it's going to send you back some data. Normally, it's going to be what the GET would ask for. So in our case, it's going to send back that response data that is going to be exactly what this GET request over here would have done. And then, since it's a string, we've got to convert it back to JSON. So we convert this back to JSON, and then we can return it, or we can console it out. And the really awesome part about this is that it should be returning with our data that we're sending over to the API to put in the database. Then we're also putting this try catch in so that if this part fails, it doesn't kill our entire application. Because otherwise, with JavaScript, when there's an error, the application goes kaput. So we set this up to where it'll send that data. We just need to make sure the data that's coming in over here is coming in as an object. So now we've covered how to get that data and how to add data to our database. The next relevant thing that we might want to do is get rid of some data. So we'll go over and we'll look at our delete. Our delete is also set up as an async function here. It's also taking in the URL, but it takes in this ID as well. And the reason for the ID is so that the API knows exactly which one of these objects in our database needs to be deleted. So we, in this process, will need to add that ID at the end of our URL. So we do our / and add the ID right at the end, and then the API knows, hey, they want to delete object number 1 or object number 2, and it's all based off of the ID setup here. So the rest of this is fairly close to what we've been doing with the other ones. We're going to set up our response variable. We're going to await our fetch, which already has our converted URL here because we reassigned it with the ID added to the end. And then we're just going to pass through that we want to use the method of delete. Now, we don't have to put a body or anything like that. Delete knows enough from the URL to know which one we want to get rid of, and that's all we really have to do at that point. Now, just like with the other ones, it's going to send back a response, and we're going to take that response as soon as it comes back. We're going to convert that response to response as JSON data. So effectively, when this runs, this is not being assigned to anything but that response data. And so I'm taking that response and converting it to JSON and assigning it to the variable here, and then we can do stuff with it, just like with our post and just like with our get. Now, we also have that catch down here to catch any kind of errors, but just like that, we very quickly have this set up in a way where it's going to take that data and delete it. Now, I know there's a lot of text on this screen, but if you'll notice, most of it is comments. There's not actually that many lines to what's happening here. It's fairly easy to follow this format for how a fetch request is going. If you're working with like Axios or jQuery and doing it, it might get a little more complex, but they also can take some of the steps out, like error handling can be a little bit different, or conversions to JSON may not be necessary depending on what you're using. So there are benefits to each way, but this fetch method has kind of become the industry standard for right now. Now you'll learn this stuff changes constantly. At the time you're watching this, it may no longer be the industry standard. It moves pretty fast. Now the last one that we haven't covered is the put. With the put, it is very similar to the post. We're going to take that URL data, and we're also going to take our object, which I like to try to put together at the top so that it's put together before we get down to the body. We've got our response, which is doing an await. It's taking that URL, and we're going to send this data through, and we're going to stringify it. Now, some put requests, depending on the API, are going to require that you also add the ID. Others don't. Kind of something that you have to read the documentation typically for. For ours, we're not sending it through. Now, the object that you're sending through, there's a couple catches to it. So let's say we're looking at, let me go back over to our data here. Let's say we're looking at building out this object and sending it through. I'm going to come over to this put, and we're going to go down to the bottom and look at this. So I've got this object, and I'm going to just say let user equal. That way it stops all the errors for a second. Now, the things that I'm going to change will need to be changed. So if I was changing the ID to like 5, then that would be changed. But the name and the email, you would also need to send data through for. And so what you're going to want to do is grab that data that's already been created that you've already done the GET request for, and make sure that you're putting in, using that dot notation, the specific things that you're needing. So let's say we were going to convert this and do let new user, or let's say updated user. When we're creating that object, you're going to want to do the ID and the email address with the new data. And then since we're not going to change the ID, which I believe I just said that wrong. So we're putting this together. We're going to take this object and we're going to leave the ID the same in this example, but we're going to change the name and the email. So I'm going to pass through the original ID of 5, but I'm going to change these two. You know, if I wanted one of these to stay the same, so let's say we were going to keep the same email, then I'm going to make sure that I'm passing through the same email. You can't just leave it blank or it's going to erase that data when it hits the API. So as you're building out these objects, you'll want to make sure, all right, so we're keeping in mind, this is our original data. Then down here, the updated is the only stuff that's going to change. The rest of it will stay the same. If you do change it, be ready for it to be changed in the API or in the data. So in our case, this db.json, it's going to flat change it. So when you're working with your objects, keep that stuff in mind. And just like that, we've gone through, we've done the 4 different parts of this. Now, some projects you will not be set up like this Vite project where I'm doing the modern JS6 imports and exports. So you may run across a time when you're doing all 4 of these in one file. That is completely okay. You'll just call on the functions the way that you normally would. They're still going to be formatted the same way. It's still going to be an export default async function. Now there is one alternate thing that you may see. So and I'll use this one since it has less text as an example. So where we do this, I'm going to make a similar method here. I'm going to say const get user, and you'll see it sometimes set up this way. And they're still using the try, and we'll do a response here and the await for the fetch and the conversion and the console. You could also add a return in here, but you'll sometimes see it laid out this way. And in this case, we would pass in URL. And so the only difference is this is set up as an arrow function would need to be. Now, you're also going to need to, in this case, put your export default. You'll see sometimes people will put that as this kind of thing afterwards. That's fine. Now, since I have 2 exports that are being labeled as default, it's saying, hey, wait, can't do that. But you'll need to remember the export for it if you use this method. But if you ever see this type, that's kind of what's going on. Now, the way that I normally will build out an application is I will get as far as doing the get and make sure that that part of my REST API interaction is working correctly so that I can pull the data in before I try to do anything else with my database. What that affords me is the ability to see if there are any errors that pop up along the way in developing my application. So make sure that you're at least getting each step to run before you move on to the next one. Because if you get multiple ones in that each have a different error of their own, then sometimes you won't be able to exactly see which error you need to work on to get the part that you're trying to work right. So make sure you're developing with it running so that you can see every interaction. Now, there are other options to kind of handle that for us too. One of those is Postman. I've got another one installed here called like Thunder Client here. Will let you put in the parameters for your REST API. You can even pass it data and pull data just to make sure that the API on the backside is running properly and see kind of the format that it's going to give you back. Now, most of the time, I'm just going to put it and let it pop that data out in the console. That way I can see what I'm getting, and I don't want to jump back and forth between the two. But it is really handy if you're working with an API to be able to throw in some data like that and test things along the way. So hopefully this gives you a good overview of how REST APIs work. This is a very simplified method of doing it. Each API is built slightly differently. And so you'll want to make sure that the API that you're using, you consult that documentation to make sure that you're putting in the API key the way that they want it. Now, also be protective of your API keys. Make sure you're not letting those go up to GitHub. If you are going to push some code to GitHub, you'll want to put it in a .env or hide it somehow. But that's a whole other topic of how to protect that data. But as far as like unsecured or public APIs, most of the time, this is your process. So hopefully that helps. Happy coding. If you need more information, you can always check helpcodeit.com.